It was the winter of 1991, and Moscow felt strangely quiet. The snow was falling, but it wasn't the cold that made people uneasy, it was the silence. A superpower that once shook the world, a nation that stretched across 11 time zones, a state that competed head-to-head with the United States for global dominance, was suddenly crumbling. People stood in long lines for bread while tanks rolled through the streets during the August coup. The red flag with the hammer and sickle, a symbol that once terrified Western nations, was slowly being lowered for the last time. And in that moment, the world realized something shocking. The Soviet Union, the mighty USSR, was dying. But why? Was it economic failure? Was it political chaos? Was it Gorbachev's reforms? Or was it something far deeper? Something that began decades before anyone noticed? In this video, we're going to uncover the real reasons behind the collapse of the Soviet Union. A story far more complex than the usual textbook explanations. Because behind the slogans, behind the propaganda, behind the red posters, there was a system decaying from within slowly, quietly, and inevitably. To understand the collapse, we need to go back to the beginning, when the dream of the Soviet Union was still shining brightly. After the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, Lenin and later Stalin built a state based on central planning, rapid industrialization, and absolute political control. For a time, it worked. The USSR transformed from a backward agrarian empire to an industrial giant in just a few decades. It defeated Nazi Germany at an unimaginable cost and emerged from World War II as a global superpower. To the world, the USSR looked strong, disciplined, unstoppable. But inside, the seeds of its collapse were already planted. The fundamental problem was the system itself. A centrally planned economy could force factories to produce steel, coal, tractors, tanks, but it couldn't innovate, it couldn't adapt. It couldn't reward efficiency or creativity. Every part of life was measured through quotas, production targets, and orders from above. And because failing to meet targets meant punishment, managers lied. Workers hid mistakes. Factories produced useless quantities of low-quality goods just to meet quotas. This created a strange reality where the Soviet Union produced enormous amounts of things, yet ordinary people still lacked basic necessities. There were years when the USSR had more tanks than refrigerators, more missiles than consumer goods, and more soldiers than toilet paper. On the world stage, the country appeared powerful. At home it was struggling. By the 1970s, the Soviet economy had slowed so badly that even its leaders could see something was wrong. But instead of reforming the system, the USSR doubled down on the Cold War. Military spending soared. Billions were poured into maintaining a massive army, building nuclear weapons, supporting communist allies around the world, and competing with the US in every field from space exploration to developing new weapons. The Afghan War, which began in 1979, drained the economy even further. What was supposed to be a quick military intervention turned into a decade-long nightmare. Tanks rolled through Afghan mountains, while coffins returned quietly to Soviet towns. The war didn't just cost money, it destroyed morale. Young soldiers returned broken, confused, and disillusioned. But the real crisis was invisible at first. Beneath the surface, corruption was spreading everywhere. The Soviet system rewarded loyalty, not competence. Bureaucrats created layers upon layers of paperwork, and every layer was another opportunity for bribery, favoritism, and inefficiency. A powerful elite called the nomenklatura lived privileged lives behind the facade of equality. Ordinary citizens saw the hypocrisy clearly, even if they couldn't say it out loud. The gap between ideology and reality grew wider every year. By the time Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, the Soviet Union was already in decline. The factories were outdated, the technology was lagging behind the West, agriculture was failing, and people were tired. Gorbachev understood that something needed to change. But he didn't realize that his reforms would unleash forces he couldn't control. His first big idea was perestroika, restructuring the economy. He wanted to introduce limited market principles, reduce central control, and allow factories more independence. But the problem was that the system was too rigid. Industries were too dependent on state orders. Managers didn't know how to operate without instructions. Instead of improving productivity, perestroika led to chaos. Prices fluctuated, supply chains collapsed, and shortages became even worse. Then came glasnost openness. For decades, the Soviet government had suppressed criticism, hidden disasters, and censored news. Gorbachev believed that allowing more transparency would help fix problems. Instead, it opened the floodgates. Newspapers published stories about famines, corruption, and government lies from the past. People learned the truth about Stalin's purges, the millions who died in the Gulag, and the disasters like Chernobyl that had been covered up. The Soviet population didn't become more trusting, they became furious. Nationalism, which had been quietly suppressed for years, resurfaced across the republics. Lithuanians, Estonians, Georgians, Ukrainians, everyone started demanding independence. The Soviet Union had always been a country held together by force, ideology, and fear. Glasnost removed the fear. Perestroika broke the economy. Together, they cracked the entire foundation of the state. And yet, the collapse wasn't caused by Gorbachev alone. The truth is that by the 1980s, the Soviet system was already collapsing under its own weight. Gorbachev simply exposed the cracks that had been there for decades. The final blow came from the one place the Soviet leadership never expected: its own party. Hardliners inside the Communist Party believed Gorbachev was destroying the USSR. In August 1991, they launched a coup. Tanks rolled into Moscow, Gorbachev was placed under house arrest, and the world held its breath. But the coup failed because the people didn't support it. Crowds gathered around the Russian parliament building, and Boris Yeltsin stood defiantly on a tank, calling for resistance. In just a few days, the coup collapsed, but its failure destroyed the authority of the Communist Party, and at that moment, the Soviet Union stopped functioning. The republics declared independence one after another. Ukraine voted overwhelmingly to leave. The Baltic states left. Central Asia followed. By December 1991, the USSR was reduced to a shell of its former self. And on December 25th, Gorbachev appeared on national television and resigned. The red flag over the Kremlin was lowered. The Soviet Union was gone. But to truly understand why it collapsed, we need to go deeper beyond politics, beyond reforms, beyond the Cold War. Because the fall of the USSR was not a single event or a single cause. It was the result of decades of structural weaknesses that no leader could fix. To truly understand why the Soviet Union collapsed, we must go back and look at the quiet forces that worked slowly beneath the surface, long before anyone realized the empire was dying. One of the most important and least discussed forces was the psychological exhaustion of the Soviet people. For decades, citizens were told that they lived in the world's most advanced society, the society of the future, the society that would one day surpass capitalism. But every trip to the grocery store, every line outside a shop, every broken appliance, every malfunctioning machine quietly told them otherwise. People learned to pretend. They applauded speeches they didn't believe. They repeated slogans that meant nothing. They worked in factories where effort didn't matter because salaries were fixed. Promotions were based on loyalty, and innovation was often punished. Over time, something inside society broke. When a system demands public enthusiasm but provides only private disappointment, people eventually stop caring. This created a phenomenon historians call internal emigration. Millions of Soviet citizens mentally withdrew from the system. They didn't rebel. They didn't protest. They didn't sabotage. They simply stopped believing. And a country where citizens no longer believe in the system, even if they continue to participate in it, cannot survive forever. Factories kept running, but the energy was absent. Schools continued teaching, but the passion was gone. The government kept issuing slogans, but nobody listened anymore. The collapse began long before 1991. It began the moment people stopped feeling that they were part of a meaningful national project. Another hidden pressure was technological stagnation. The Soviet Union excelled in military technology. It produced excellent missiles, tanks, and jet fighters. But consumer technology, computers, communications, electronics, the backbone of modern economies, lagged far behind. While American companies were inventing personal computers, microchips, and advanced software, the Soviet Union was still struggling to manufacture basic electronics. The country relied heavily on copying Western technology, sometimes literally smuggling machines, blueprints, and microchips from abroad. But a system built on secrecy and rigid hierarchy cannot nurture innovation. Scientists and engineers had little freedom to experiment. Research institutes operated under bureaucratic control. And because there was no competition, there was no incentive to improve. This technological gap became catastrophic during the 1980s. The West entered the digital revolution, while the USSR remained stuck in an industrial, factory-driven economy. Modern economies require flexibility, creativity, and technological adaptation qualities that central planning simply could not provide. This gap crippled Soviet productivity and made it impossible for the country to keep pace with global changes. Then came another silent killer: demographics. By the 1980s, birth rates in Russia, Ukraine, and the Baltic states were falling rapidly, while alcoholism, workplace accidents, and health problems skyrocketed. Heavy drinking became a national crisis. Soviet men had one of the lowest life expectancies in the developed world. A weak, unhealthy workforce drained the economy, slowed production, and increased social problems. The government tried to restrict alcohol sales, but this only created a massive black market for illegal liquor. In many ways, the state had lost the ability to control society, even in areas where it once seemed all-powerful. But the biggest cracks were political. For decades, the Soviet Union held together dozens of different ethnic groups, cultures, and nationalities under one flag. It did this through force, censorship, and ideological unity. But when glasnost opened the door to free expression, people began speaking openly about historical grievances. The Baltic states demanded the restoration of independence. The Caucasus republics protested for autonomy. Ukraine began asserting its national identity. Central Asian republics questioned Moscow's authority. Suddenly, it became clear that the Soviet Union was not a single unified nation. It was an empire held together only by the power of the state. And when the state weakened, the empire dissolved. Boris Yeltsin understood this better than anyone. While Gorbachev tried to save the Union through reforms, Yeltsin realized that the future of Russia lay outside the Soviet structure. After the failure of the August coup, Yeltsin had the political momentum. He banned the Communist Party in Russia, seized its assets, and positioned himself as the leader of a new independent Russia. When Ukraine voted for independence in December 1991, the Soviet Union became mathematically impossible to maintain. Without Ukraine, there was no USSR. Its population, economy, and territory were irreversibly broken. And so, within weeks, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met secretly in a forest lodge in Delavesa and signed the agreement that dissolved the Soviet Union. Gorbachev was informed after the decision was already made. The collapse wasn't an explosion. It was a quiet signing of documents in a secluded cabin. But even this final moment was only the surface. The deeper truth is that the Soviet Union collapsed because it was built on contradictions that no society can sustain forever. It promised equality but created elites. It claimed to represent workers but punished independent labor. It preached collectivism but relied on fear. It insisted that it had surpassed capitalism, even as its citizens traveled abroad and saw with their own eyes how much higher the living standards were in the West. The system demanded ideological loyalty, but it could not provide a life that matched its promises. By the 1980s, the gap between ideology and reality had grown so large that the system simply lost legitimacy. And then there was the economic contradiction at the heart of the Soviet model. A command economy can mobilize resources quickly, especially during crises or wars. The USSR excelled at this. But once the country reached a level where society demanded better living conditions, better food, better housing, better consumer goods, and better technology, the system failed. It could build tanks faster than the United States, but it couldn't build washing machines. It could send rockets into space, but it couldn't feed its own people without importing grain. A superpower that can't grow enough food for itself is living on borrowed time. In the final years, even the government understood that the system was collapsing, but it was too late. The economy was shrinking, the stores were empty, the military was exhausted. The republics were leaving, the people had lost faith. The leaders were divided, the ideology was hollow. And the world was changing faster than the USSR could respond. Once the momentum of collapse began, nothing could stop it. Not Gorbachev, not Yeltsin, not the Communist Party, not even the army. On December 25, 1991, as the red flag came down from the Kremlin for the last time, and the Russian tricolor rose in its place, the world witnessed the quiet end of a 74-year experiment. The Soviet Union did not collapse because of a single event. It collapsed because its foundation was built on contradictions, fears, and illusions. It collapsed because it could not adapt, could not innovate, and could not meet the needs of its people. Above all, it collapsed because the people who once believed in the dream of communism no longer believed in the reality of the state that claimed to represent them. The fall of the Soviet Union reshaped the world. It ended the Cold War. It created 15 new nations. It shifted global power. And it remains one of the most important events of the 20th century, not because a superpower disappeared overnight, but because it showed that even the strongest empires can crumble when they fail to win the trust, the belief, and the hopes of their own people.